In recent years, the topic of remaking and re-releasing old games has become a pretty hot one in the gaming community. Whether it's for making certain classics more accessible to modern audiences or to preserve games that are in danger of being lost to time, I don't think there's ever been a time when the remake topic has been so present in this space than it is right now. And what also adds fuel to this fire is the fact that there's been a steady rise in new remakes over the past decade or so, possibly giving some people reason to call this an age of remakes or something. And like with any hot topic, especially when it comes to the gamers, there's bound to be arguments about it. Whether every badly aged game should just be redone and let the old versions fade away, or if the original is the only way to go and the whole remaking business is tainting the current state of video games. As for what I think, well, that's why this video is here. As the title and the thumbnail might already imply, in this video I'd like to examine some remakes I've played and some famous ones that I might have not but still know a fair bit about to find out, why remake at all? Are they here to simply overwrite the old, purely for game preservation and accessibility, or is there something more beyond the surface? I don't expect to find a definitive answer, of course, but if you'd like to hear my 2 cents on the matter, sit back, relax, maybe grab a cool drink, and join me on this journey to find the purpose of a video game remake. Before we get down to the nitty-gritty, we should probably go over the differences between the terminology used when talking about remakes. You often hear words like remaster and reboot thrown around in the same vein as a remake when they do have some pretty clear differences. But even then, they have some weird subterms, and let's just get into it. The most clear one out of these is probably the term reboot. Unlike a remake that sets out to redo existing material as faithfully as possible in most cases, reboot is a complete overhaul of an existing franchise, usually set in a new continuity aside from the original. So the characters could have the same names but different backstories and/or personalities. The game could have a completely new cast with a lot of similar mythos from the original, or just a new gameplay style. Usually it's pretty easy to tell when a game is a reboot and not a remake, but there are some not so clear cases as well. What muddies the water even more is the term soft reboot, which again overhauls a lot of things from the original game. It's just like a normal reboot, but it takes place in the same continuity. Stuff like the PS4 God of War, Pokemon Black and White, and Resident Evil 7, games that clearly take place in the same universe, but most of the more familiar stuff from previous games have been stripped away. These are thankfully much clearer to differentiate from remakes since they're more like sequels than anything, but sometimes they like to name the game exactly the same as the original, just like with hard reboots, and that's totally not confusing at all. Anyways, the game type that is actually pretty synonymous with remakes is a remaster, which is not entirely true, but it also is in some cases. I hate this terminology so much, my god! So, usually, the main difference between a remake and a remaster is that a remaster is simply a re-release of the original game in high definition or something, with maybe a few quality of life changes. You saw a lot of these during the PS3 days, and stuff like the Sly trilogy, Metal Gear Solid HD collection, and the Kingdom Hearts HD remixes are all remasters in the strictest sense of the word. But there are some remasters that can be considered from the ground up remakes. Examples include, but are not limited to, Crash Bandicoot Insane Trilogy, Spyro Reignited Trilogy, Battle for Bikini Bottom Rehydrated, Klonoa Wii, Ocarina of Time 3D, Super Mario RPG, all remakes that are as faithful as possible to the original, but still feel at least somewhat different. Which is why at large these are usually called one-to-one remakes as opposed to remasters. So as confusing as these can get, there is a pretty clear divide between these 3 terms. And while for the purposes of this video we'll be mostly sticking to strictly remakes, there is a reason why I brought these terms up. Trust me, it'll all make sense later down the line. With the technicalities out of the way, let's move on to the real meat of the video. Like I alluded to in the beginning, the most prominent argument when it comes to remakes is whether the original or the remake is the better or the definitive way to experience the game. With stuff like remasters and one-to-one remakes, this usually isn't a problem. Usually, but with remakes that bring their own bells and whistles to the table, well, suddenly a bunch of people have pitchforks in their hands. And in a way, I can understand that mindset, especially if the game in question happens to be close to your heart. Maybe you don't think the game really needs a remake, or maybe you do, but there are a bunch of these arbitrary changes that just don't sit right with you for one reason or another. And that's really the biggest reason to argue with remakes in the first place. The changes. And change is very scary. That's why one-to-one remakes have become so common nowadays, because the developers want to be as faithful as possible to the originals and only really updating the looks as to not trample on the feet of the fans who loved the original. But then we run into the problem of possibly being a bit too faithful. One example I always think of when this dilemma is brought up are the Pokemon remakes, or more specifically, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire and its immediate successor, I suppose, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. When the games were first released, ORAS was heavily criticized for changing some things about the originals or completely omitting them, and overall feeling more like a Gen 6 game in Hoenn than a remake of Gen 3. But in the case of BDSP, the problem was the opposite, staying too close to the original, with even the art style mimicking the original DS graphics, as opposed to modernizing them in the style of the current-gen Pokemon games like the 3 previous remakes did. And while in my humble opinion there's a lot to like about both of these remakes in comparison to their originals, yes, even BDSP, but that's a topic for another day, there's a thread you can see when you take the reception of each sequential generation remake into account. After the massive success of the Gen 2 remakes, it's possible Game Freak simply wanted to create a completely new Hoenn experience with ORAS, capitalizing on how they took some elements of Crystal to beef up HGSS and pushing it even further. But since they didn't just want to do the exact same thing again, instead of taking the ingredients from Emerald, they decided to scoop up their new shiny X and Y instead and add in a bunch of completely new stuff in the mix as well. However, this ended up backfiring as people weren't exactly fond of the changes made to the Hoenn journey, the Gen 6 mechanics didn't really mesh all too well with the core game, and the omission of the Emerald content made people especially mad. That's why to me, at least in part, BDSP feels like a knee-jerk reaction to the critical reception of ORAS, where the game goes way too much to the other extreme. Of course, there are some other obvious factors as well, like the fact that the game was made by a completely different developer, but since I doubt ILCA just had completely free hands to do whatever the hell they wanted, I wouldn't be surprised if the Pokemon Company or Game Freak influenced their direction with the Gen 4 remakes due to some of the complaints people had with ORAS. All that being said, maybe these two aren't the best examples of criticized remakes on the opposite ends of the spectrum, since they both do have other issues as well, but when it comes to them simply being remakes, I think they demonstrate my point pretty well. If the remake in question is too similar to the original, people might complain about the remake not really fixing anything with the original game. If it's too different, it might stray too far from what made the original great, to the point where people will swear by that original. And in the case of the latter, even good changes in the remake may not save it in the eyes of the audience. A good example of this is the 3DS remake of The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. Despite its many quality of life improvements for things that people found daunting or even downright bad in the original N64 game, most fans will probably tell you to stay away from the remake. This mostly because of some questionable changes made to things like the bosses, the movesets of your mask transformations, and the overall atmosphere of the game. And while to me some of this criticism does stink a little bit of elitism towards the OG Majora's Mask, it's not like none of it is valid, especially Zora Link only being able to swim faster with magic use. oof. But the point here is that even if you do your damnedest to try and fix some of the original's problems in a remake, there's no guarantee people will appreciate that if you go too far with it. Now, you might be thinking the best way is to just find a balance, right? Change things that might be too dated and keep most of the original intent and experience intact. But here's the issue. Not everything is objectively dated. Who can definitively say which feature, mechanic, or even a glitch in a game should, by all accounts, be removed or changed in a remake, because there might be people out there who enjoy these dated aspects? And here we get to the big question. With all this in mind, what really is the purpose of a video game remake? Because from the ground we've covered so far, making a perfect remake might be pretty impossible. No matter how you slice it, each viewing of the original game is subjective, and the developers of the game don't necessarily have the same views as some fans, or even a majority of the fans do. But what if I told you that none of that matters? Because remakes are not supposed to be replacements. Yes, remakes can be a way of fixing some of the problems or dated aspects of an older game. Yes, remakes can work as a way of making an old title more accessible for a modern audience, both in terms of its content and gameplay, and simply making it available on newer platforms. But that's not all a remake could be. Because if that was the case, remasters and ports should be more than enough. The way I see it, remakes should first and foremost be a way of accompanying the original, even enhancing it by offering its own unique take on it. And here's where the term reboot becomes slightly more relevant. In essence, reboots are remakes of already existing IPs, just with complete freedom in everything. Reboots can do whatever the hell they want in terms of its gameplay, story, or characters, while remakes, no matter how different, usually follow the same through line in their plot as the original, are still at least in the same genre, and the characters are recognizable as their original counterparts. With that, I want to present 3 examples of remakes that, despite their somewhat mixed fan reception, I think do a great job of offering a new experience between themselves and the original. Final Fantasy VII and its ongoing 3-parter remake project, Yakuza 1 and 2 and their Kiwami remakes, and Ratchet & Clank and its 2016 remake on the PS4. All 3 of these remakes offer an experience that I think don't invalidate the original and even make the original worth playing in addition to them. Starting with Ratchet, the 2016 remake is often frowned upon for butchering the original plot and characters, cutting off half the planets of the original game, and generally making the game a lot easier than the original due to the game having a lot of the quality of life additions made to the series formula since that first game. But when viewed as its own thing, and more importantly, not as something replacing the original 2002 game, these problems are not necessarily as major as some people make them out to be. Well, the story still kinda sucks ass, but anyway, the original PS2 game is a little hard to go back to nowadays, since it's missing a lot of things that became staples after the first game, most notably upgrading weapons and health, as well as strafing. But it still has plenty of its own qualities that make it worth going back to, even despite the hurdles. Most of the planets are really well designed and memorable, the story is pretty decent for what it is, and the game in general has a weird but charming tone that none of the other RNC games, aside from maybe Going Commando, really share. The 2016 remake, on the other hand, while I'd argue is more likely to be a better experience for a complete newcomer to Ratchet & Clank than a series veteran, particularly if you swear by the PS2 games and don't like any of the newer stuff from the PS3 onwards, I think it still has more than enough merits to enjoy as a companion piece to the PS2 original. Just tune out the mostly awful cookie-cutter story for a second, hear me out. First of all, while the cut planets are disappointing, seeing the ones that did make the cut rebuilt into this jaw-droppingly beautiful game is great to see, and the way some planets are even expanded and changed make the experience that much more enhanced, even for the fans of the original. As for the difficulty complaints, did we play the same game? Maybe it's not as hard as the original, since the amount of health items and checkpoints is pretty generous, but on the hardest difficulty at least, this remake does have some teeth, especially compared to some of the preceding titles. Maybe I'm just bad at video games, which is fair, but that hard mode can hard when you least expect it. While I'm not saying you can't dislike the 2016 game because it's just trying to do something new with the old material, I think the mentality that it should just be an upgrade of the original game is a bit flawed. What the 2016 game tries to be is a modernized take on the PS2 classic with weaponry, mechanics, and design added in from all the RNC games since that first game, with also being tied to the shitty plot of a movie no one gives a shit about. Final Fantasy VII Remake, on the other hand, should be a little clearer on this matter. From day one, Square made it pretty clear just how different this remake was going to be compared to the original PS1 game. The combat was made real-time action as opposed to turn-based, Sephiroth has much more presence throughout the story, and multiple minor characters get a major makeover and plenty more screen time. From the very beginning, Remake was never meant to be a replacement for the original, but unlike RNC 2016, which is just a modernized take and not much more, I'd argue 7 Remake very much encourages the player to play the original game. We're going to dip a little into spoiler territory here, but I'm going to try my best to be as vague about the details as possible. But if you haven't played Remake yet and would like to play it safe, I'll just leave this timestamp here for your convenience. The thing with 7 Remake is that its big moments near the end of the story especially, and how it attempts to deviate from the original, are very heavily reliant on the player already knowing how the original story played out. That's not to say you have to play the OG FF7 to just understand Remake's story, but it very much encourages you to. Even if you're playing the remake as someone who hasn't played the original, the chances are very high that you still have some semblance of knowledge about it, and that surface level knowledge is enough. When the characters are talking about how things are happening as destiny ordains, one can pretty easily make the connection to the original game, even if you don't know the specific moments from the original story. And that's what entices the player to check the original out, to see what exactly is this destiny that Remake tries to fight against. That being said, I've heard Rebirth does actually need the context from OG FF7, but I think this argument still applies to Remake at least. And that's just the story portion. Just the fact that the remake completely changes the main gameplay style of FF7 is also a factor in giving the player incentive for checking out the original. Sure, you might have a preference for action RPGs over turn-based or vice versa, but the fact still stands that the OG FF7 and the remake trilogy are fundamentally very different games. Your experience with the original will absolutely be different from your time with the remake, because while there are similar systems in place, as a turn-based RPG, the original is much more focused on things like strategy and managing numbers. However, while the FF7 remake is probably the most obvious example of this type of remake out there, for me personally, and from the remakes I've experienced, the best examples of remakes being more than just replacements are Yakuza Kiwami and Yakuza Kiwami 2. They were pretty much the main reason I wanted to make this video after all. Now, let me level with you here. You can absolutely play only one version of either of these games and call it a day. They both share the exact same story with their PS2 counterparts, some additional cutscenes in Kiwami 1 notwithstanding, so if your main goal is to just get caught up with the series, then go nuts! Fire up that PS4 or whatever and just play the new and shiny versions. However, if you're willing to put a little more time into this franchise, or if you're simply curious to see the series' roots, I highly recommend playing both the original PS2 games and their Kiwami remakes. Because at the end of the day, despite following the same groundwork, these games are all very different beasts. They each have their own strengths and weaknesses, things that are better in the other version, things that were lost in transition, and things that you simply can't experience if you only stick to one version of the game. The original Yakuza 1 is very archaic compared to the rest of the series and has a lot of weird design quirks that none of the others really have. Janky combat, sub-stories that expire if you don't do them immediately, very limited item boxes, obtrusive equipment management, things very indicative of the classic first game syndrome. But again, if you're interested in the series' roots, this game is a very important part of the series' history. Particularly with...
Get over here, motherfucker! Excuse you? No. Fuck you!
You're a bunch of pussies. All of you.
You're not coming in here, you fucking asshole!
Kill this arrogant motherfucker!
Bring that shit, Kazuma! 10 years in the joint made you a fucking pussy!
Did feel the urge to hit some balls today. Suppose yours will have to do.
This job is an extremely valuable relic of history and should be treated as such. But even if you're not interested in a history lesson or having peak fiction pass through your ears, Yakuza 1 has some other perks when compared to the Kiwami remake too. Some of the sub-stories are only present in this version, and some of the story beats flow a little better due to the absence of certain mechanics from the remake. So in my eyes, there's a multitude of reasons why Yakuza 1 is still worth playing, even if you've already gone through Kiwami. Yakuza 2, on the other hand, fixed a few problems with the original game, so going back to it shouldn't be as rough gameplay-wise, but the real reason you should play Yakuza 2 is its exclusive content. Like Yakuza 1, several of the sub-stories were completely cut from Kiwami 2, but Yakuza 2 also had 2 whole side minigames and even a whole explorable map cut as well. Kiwami 2 does have its own minigames, which are both better, to replace the ones from the original, but the fact still remains that these sub-games are very different in their content when compared to the Hostess Manager and the Clan Creator. As for Tsunecho being cut... yeah, I got nothing. They really had no excuse for this one. I will fully admit that as overall experiences, I do prefer both the Kiwami remakes for multiple reasons, but nothing they have erases the value of the PS2 originals. So while I could do without Yakuza 2 sending me on a wild goose chase around Osaka or forcing me to look at a random ass cat somewhere to get a useful ability, I'm still glad I played it because there's so much I wouldn't have gotten to experience had I just stuck to Kiwami 2. It might sound like a bad thing, and believe me, the internet has done its work dragging the Kiwami remakes through the mud, but like I've already said, I think expecting a remake to just be some kind of upgrade for the original is a flawed train of thought. At the end of the day, I'm not saying that remakes shouldn't be compared to their originals at all, or that they're somehow free from all criticism just because they're trying to do something new. I'm just sick of people arguing against the existence of remakes in bad faith because they either hate modern gaming or are simply purists towards the originals. Yet I'm also tired of people whining about not getting the definitive version of something in one package because they can't bear the thought of booting up an old and dated game to get some additional experience. I'm also not saying that these three are the exact blueprint that every remake should follow, but they do have the right idea. The point I'm trying to make here is that while remakes will keep getting made, they will never erase the original games from existence, be it through emulation, digital storefronts, or used game stores. More often than not, you will likely always have some form of access to the original, even if the new shiny remake is jump scaring you in every store you go to. So with this video, I mainly wanted to say that I think remakes and their originals can coexist, and in the best case scenario, offer completely new experiences to the player regardless of whether they've played the original or not. But I am aware not everyone sees it my way. Of course, I'm sure there are people who'll see remakes as a waste of time no matter what, or people who think a remake should just be the best version of the original. But perhaps the most prominent people who don't see this potential in remakes are the people making them. In this day and age, with some very few exceptions, when a game is remade, the original is usually left to dust in the previous console generation. And if the game has already had a port to the gen the remake is also a part of, sometimes the developers will pull the original game from the storefronts so that the audience would be more likely to buy the new shiny product instead. And not only is that some scummy ass anti-consumer shit, but this clearly sends a message that the developer sees that new product as a replacement for the original, and that saddens me more than anything. Sure, there do exist some remakes that I think kind of replace the original in some way, like for including the original game packaged in with the remake, or if there's no way to play the original game due to a language barrier or a region-locked console. And I know there are some originals that are still just as accessible as their remakes, like Resident Evil 4 and Final Fantasy 7, but those are very much the exception rather than the norm. The fact too that one-to-one remakes are most developers' go-to way of remakes nowadays also speaks volumes on their stance on them. And in general, I think the current remake culture just feeds into this mindset way too much. Suddenly games that were downright revolutionary for their time need to be fixed because their mechanics are old and every aspect of every video game has only gone up in quality with the passage of time. Yup, it's a vicious cycle where the demands of the audience give the developers the idea that these older games need to be fixed, while the continuous pumping of remakes meant to replace the original feeds into the remake culture mindset. And as long as this cycle holds, these developers and publishers will remain as the true enemy of remakes. Accessibility is very important for any game, new or old, and though there will always be ways of accessing the original content in less than official capacity, the fact of the matter is that if the people making the remakes or the audience aren't willing to break the cycle, this age-old argument will never end. So for now, I suppose remakes will just stay as a topic of hot debate. But to avoid ending this video on a sour note, I want you all to know that even in spite of everything I've said so far, there's nothing wrong with simply having a preference or even with sticking to just one version of the game. Like I've said, remakes are not safe from criticism in the slightest. So if you have no interest in playing a remake of a game you've already played because it doesn't look appealing to you, or if you played both the original and the remake and decided the original is more up your alley, that's completely fine. And obviously the reverse is true as well. If you like the remake more, or if you have no desire to play the original, no one is going to force you to. I'm the same way. I love Wind Waker HD and Persona 4 Golden, and while going back to their original versions could be interesting, I don't really have a desire to do so at the moment for multiple reasons. I'm not trying to change anyone's mind here. If you don't like a game, then you don't like it. I'm just tired of the narrative that remakes are out to replace and ruin their originals. Now, everything we've discussed so far might also bring up the question of which games should get the remake treatment if they're not meant to be replacements. And while I do have some opinions on that matter, it could really be its own video entirely, so I won't go into it here. My end goal with this video is just to basically show that remakes kinda deserve better. In my opinion, remaking a video game could be so much more than just spicing up the graphics or bringing the mechanics to modern standards. Make something new out of it. Use the original framework to give even the fans the original something new to chew on. Truly breathe new life into the classic you're bringing back. Remakes aren't supposed to make their originals obsolete. They're supposed to be experiences complementing the original, a window to what it could be like if it was first made today. And that, what I think at least, is the true purpose of a video game remake.